Thank you very much to the United Sikh Foundation for inviting me today to participate in this discussion, which I think is extremely important discussion because it deals with issues that I have been dealing with for the last 40 years, and that is oppression, discrimination, and lack of religious freedom. My name is Ali Liami. I am from Saudi Arabia, and I found and direct the Center for Democracy and Human Rights in Saudi Arabia, based in Washington, D.C., because I cannot do it in Saudi Arabia. If I could do what I do in Washington in Saudi Arabia, then I would have retired a long time ago. Now, I cannot retire. I was thinking about that actually, but then about 2 months ago, I got a grandchild, the first one. I was holding her in my hand. She was 20 minutes old, and I said to myself, I think my thinking of retirement is gone. There is a lot of work to do to make sure that she also have a secure and safe and democratic life to live. Our discussion about whether the United Nations meets its obligation and implement its charter. And I decided to write my speech because I am a very undisciplined speaker, and if I just speak, I will be going all over the place and you get confused. And I didn't think that's right. As a promoter of human rights, democratic principles, and individual liberty, I find the United Nations failure to uphold its values as proclaimed in the preamble to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights inexcusable. I substituted, I had abominable, but I put inexcusable because it's more polite. This failure also offers a convincing reason to reconstruct the organization in a manner that will make the implementation of its Human Rights Declaration mandatory and enforceable. The preamble of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights reads as follows, and I just quote from the preamble. Quote, whereas recognition of the inherent dignity and of the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family is the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world. Whereas disregard and contempt for human rights have resulted in barbarous acts which have outraged the conscience of humankind, and the advent of a world in which human beings shall enjoy freedom of speech and belief and freedom from fear, one has been proclaimed as the highest aspiration of common people. Whereas it is essential, if a man or a woman is not to be compelled to have a recourse, and this is very important actually, as last resort to rebellion against tyranny and oppression, that human rights should be protected by the rule of law. That's what's happening in the Arab world today. The revolts in the Arab world today is because people had absolutely no choice but to resort to violence. Sadly, unquote, sadly, many government signatories to this declaration consistently grossly violate the human rights of their own populations. This is due to the fact that the majority of the members of the United Nations are authoritarians who are unelected or elected, as in the Arab world, for example, or elected without opposition, as in the cases of most Asian and African states. However, there is no region where dictator rules more than in the Arab world, especially in the oil-rich Gulf states, where an estimated 12 million poverty-stricken Asian migrant workers work under slavery-like conditions. About 3 million of those 12 million are actually Indians. This brings me to Saudi Arabia, a founding member of the United Nations and signatory to its charter, which states, quote, "Everyone is entitled to all the rights and freedoms set forth in this declaration, without distinction of any kind, such as race, color, sex, language, religion, political or other opinion, national or social origin, property, birth, or other status. Furthermore, no distinction shall be made on the basis of the political, jurisdictional, or international status of the country or territory to which a person belongs, whether it be independent trust, non-self-governing, or under any other limitations of sovereignty." Unquote. Human rights groups, United Nations agencies, and global media have amply established that Saudi Arabia is one of the most flagrant violators of the United Nations Charter. This is the one the Saudis signed in 1948. Charter. Gross violations of basic human rights and are institutionalized and enforced by the Saudi government agencies. For example, the doctrinal belief of the minority ruling families, known as the Wahhabi doctrine, is imposed on the religiously diverse population of the country. Saudi Arabia is the only country where Muslim religious rituals are physically enforced. If you don't pray, they beat you by religious police. Conversely, non-Muslims are forbidden from practicing their own religion. You cannot practice your religion. Hillary Clinton goes to sit with the king of Saudi Arabia, but she cannot practice her Christianity. Then she comes out praising him as a promoter of religious tolerance. All forms of assembly, free expression, freedom of press, religious freedom, and freedom of worship, women's equal rights, and the right to criticize the Saudi royals and the religious establishment are considered antithetical to Islamic teachings and God's will. These basic human rights are barred by royal decrees and religious ethics. I am being told to stop. This is the end of my speech. I make it short and sweet. Some comments or couple of comments I would like to say about what was said before me in these panels, and somebody mentioned the Sharia law. I'm glad there is a Baha'i speaker here today, because she will attest to the fact that the Baha'is all over the Muslim countries are the most oppressed people in the world under the Sharia law. And I don't know if the speaker, the senator, stays here. He mentioned something about the Sharia law. I am totally opposed to any implementation of any aspect of Sharia law in this country. It is nothing but oppression. Most Muslims, not all Muslims, are more oppressed under the Sharia law than any other religion or any other ideology. The only rule of law that should prevail in this country is the United States Constitution, because we all are equal under the rule of law. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Alami, Ms. Judith, and Bobby, for sharing your views. Ms. Pani, would you like to share some few words? Maybe
If you pass it here. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I feel like I'm double dipping in your generous hospitality. But since you had me on the panel, I just have 3 or 4 short points, and this is to directly address the topic of this panel, the challenges and solutions offered by the UN and beyond the UN. Sitting here, I was going through the brochure of the United Sikhs, or maybe it's about the Sikh faith. And the one thing that I grew up I'll say it again, I grew up in a Sikh family, and I have a lot of love and regard for Sikhism. And that's not the reason why I became a Baha'i. I didn't have any issue with Sikhism, but I adopted a new faith that is global, etc. And I'm not going to get into that. But the reason I was taught for the turban and for the look of Sikhs was to fight for religious freedom. And because it was an identity, Hindus were being oppressed at the time by the rulers who happened to be Islamic, and there was conversion by the sword. And the Guru said, the 10th Guru said, he didn't want any Sikh to deny his faith, but rather there would be this identity, so not only to stand up for himself, but also for others that might be in need. And so I very much feel, working for freedom of religion and belief at the UN, this is something that I certainly have taken from my Sikh heritage. But that said, governments are very conscious of, they don't like being named and shamed. But it is this naming and shaming that is the one that works at the United Nations. So I think United Sikhs, I don't believe, have consultative status with the UN, and under the current situation it's unlikely that you would get it in a hurry, because it's member states that have to admit you in, and of course France and others might not want United Sikhs as NGO. However, there are NGOs that work for human rights, and it's very important to make those close allies in order to get statements at the Human Rights Council. I've just returned from the Human Rights Council. I did not hear any statement. There should have been a statement made by an NGO. Governments need to be lobbied. Elizabeth earlier, the earlier panel talked about the Universal Periodic Review. And yes, you can have NGOs making statements, but I think even more importantly, member states can ask questions. And so again, I think all that lobbying has to begin now to seek out key countries. Canada might do it, the UK might do it, India might do it. Significant populations of Sikhs, and Sikhs have their rights to their turban and their other identity in these countries. They might ask a question. That's all they have to do, is ask a question of France. And then France, that question goes on the record, and France will be responsible to either adopt that as a recommendation or not. And yeah, I think these are the fight one issue at a time, not conflate too many, keep it simple. And it shouldn't be an us versus them thing. I know it's a head covering issue in France, and perhaps this is a time to have solidarity with the hijabi women. Whether we agree with, whether a Muslim woman should wear a hijab or not, or whether Sikh should wear a turban or not, this is an issue about a human right, and I think there's solidarity there, and it should be fought as a human right and not just as a personal thing. Thank you.
Thank you so much, all of you, for sharing your views. Though we're running short on time, but I think we can welcome 1 or 2 questions maximum. So, any questions? Yes, please.
Thank you very much. This question is for Dr. Bobby. My question is to you: what happens to a country which rejects the findings of the United Nations? For example, I would say France rejected what the finding was from United Nations that they are in violation of a right to a turban. Does United Nations work with European courts also in the human rights courts, so that they can work together and put a pressure on France? If I'm asking the question correctly. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to be really, I guess, unfair right now, but let me explain that we're actually out of time, and also that you've asked an extremely complicated question. Extremely. The United Nations is not a monolith, and I really appreciate what Bonnie just said, because she's describing how you have to be very aware of the different possibilities for creating coalitions, for pressure points, and it's these specific procedures. So, for instance, the Universal Periodic Review, which Bonnie was just talking about, is a complicated, very complicated set of procedures, but it allows for opportunity. So I think whenever you're thinking about a particular issue, You're always looking for the multiple possibilities. So I think her recommendations are excellent. I want to fully support them. But I do want to say that the United Nations is literally 193 member nations. Okay, that's what it is. The Secretariat is basically more, if you have to think of it more as an administrative arm of the 193 member nations, and then we have the permanent 5 on the Security Council. So if you look through the whole system, it's so complicated. I would just be completely bizarre right now if I tried to answer your question, because I would be saying something so inadequate. So I'm not good, but Bonnie's going to answer.
Sorry. But just to answer quickly, what the Human Rights Committee gave was a recommendation. The United Nations doesn't make decisions. I've been hearing all through the morning as well, the United Nations decision. The United Nations does not make decisions, it makes recommendations. So the committee, the Human Rights Committee, made a recommendation to France, a set of recommendations on this issue. So it's not exactly like a court. The UN doesn't function as a court. It's a club of nations, as Bobby said, and they make recommendations to each other, they pass resolutions on issues, but none of them are binding, none of them have teeth, unless it's a Security Council resolution that specifically calls for sanctions on a particular state. And there have been very few of those, and very, very egregious matters which are highly politically charged. So politics, it's a club of nations, it's a political body. So.
Can I say something to this? Yeah. Well, first of all, I want to thank you for the good work you did. And I know that organizing conferences are extremely difficult. It's also expensive. So all the members here, if they have the money, they should write checks to keep me going. I know what it takes to run a non-profit organization. And I have no money either, otherwise I could see, the General Assembly is controlled by absolute dictators. They are the violators of the rights they come to discuss here. So when they violate their people's rights, they come to the United Nations Hall, and then they make these recommendations, and guess who has to approve it? The violators of these rights. It's a useless organization that was created with good intentions and good reasons. Eleanor Roosevelt was a very sharp woman, the former wife of the President of the United States. And she really wanted something good to happen. But that's only writing in paper, as I read here. The problem is with the people and the UN, who rules the UN. One thing that the Sikh in this room everywhere should do, I think you will do yourself a big favor if you distinguish your turban from the burqa and the hijab and the scarf. The burqa is signs of oppression and denigration of women and other people. The turban is a colorful, useless, it means nothing to anybody except to the people who wear it. Burqa means more than that. So I think you should distinguish yourselves from the burqa, because you are victim of Islamist terrorism.
Thank you so much. And I request, we're running short on time, so if you have any specific questions, you can get in touch with the panel. Maybe, after the session, they'll be here for some time. And so, thank you so much, all of you, for being here. I'll request Mr. Gurdeep Singh Narula, who's a community member for New York City, to please come and give away the